To land on today. Thanks, Byron. This will all become clear later on. My little maker, maybe a little bit. Go on, yeah, let's give it reverse, reverse, reverse. Brilliant. Now, we find ourselves in an incredible book up an incredible mountain. I don't know how many of you like climbing mountains. Any mountain climbers in the room? Anyone going to own up to that? Oh, a few little nods, maybe. Now, I grew up being kind of forced to climb mountains. And so I didn't force my daughter to climb mountains when she was growing up because I thought, well, I'm not going to force her and we'll see where we get. And then one day, when she was 14, she says to me, Mum, I really want to climb a mountain. And I thought, right, this is my moment. This is great. And so we planned this trip to Snowdonia. I thought, that's a safe one. I walked up Snowdonia when I was 4. She'll be fine. So we planned this trip, my husband, my daughter and I, and we planned to go to Snowdonia. And I thought, well, we won't go up the easy path because I did that when I was 4. So, let's go a more scenic route. Now, I am not the best map reader. There's kind of a living joke in this church that if you go out with Laura on a walk, you might get lost. And this is certainly what happened when we tried to walk up Snowdon. We started off on a medium route and ended up on the most challenging route that pretty much involves rock climbing. And we had eaten all the snacks that we had in our bag. We had our dog with us at that point, who was attached to my waist in one of those kind of running dog walking things. And I ended up having to carry the dog up this rock climbing mountain and watch my husband and daughter struggle behind me. By the time we got to the top, they were complaining. They were hungry. And it was fine though, because I assured them, when we get to the top, it's okay, Snowdonia has a cafe. So we're going to have lunch. It's going to be lovely. And you guys can just get the train down. I know it's been hard, and I'll walk down with the dog. When we got to the top, the view was cloudy. You couldn't even see beyond about 3 feet in front of you. So we got to the top of this mountain, and we found the cafe, and the cafe was locked. Turns out the weather had prevented people going to work that day. Not only was the cafe locked, but the train was closed. And that had prevented my husband and daughter from being able to go down on the train. And so I had a very grumpy husband and daughter walking about 6 feet behind me down this mountain. And so our kind of trip of excitement of, yes, we're going to climb this mountain together turned into a slight we'll go down in history trip in our family. And I don't think they'll ever trust me to plan a walk up a mountain with them again. In today's reading, we find Moses on Mount Horeb. And he's been living in the wilderness for about 40 years at this point. Now, that's a bit of a shock to his system, and we've skipped a little bit of the Exodus story here. Now, last week, we were hearing about Moses as a baby who ended up in a palace. What happened in between? Now, if you look in Exodus 2, if you've got a Bible, I encourage you to have it open because we're studying this scripture together. You can see the story of how Moses gets here. We get to know that he grew up in the palace, and then suddenly, at some point, he grows up. The storyteller doesn't tell us much about his life. It just says, when Moses had grown up. Great, okay. When Moses had grown up, he noticed something. His eyes started to notice the world around him. He noticed the enslaved people. We don't know if he had any idea that he was actually a hidden Israelite at this point. We don't know if he knew that or if he just thought he was an Egyptian too. But he'd grown up and he noticed the way people were treating the Israelites. He went out on a walk one day and looked around. He saw someone beating up a Hebrew and he intervened. He intervened, and it tells us that he killed this Egyptian who was beating this Hebrew up and hid their body in the sand. And then we find that he notices again some Hebrews arguing with one another. And he realizes actually what must have happened is Pharaoh must have found out. If Pharaoh had found out that he killed one of his own to save a Hebrew, it would have all gone a bit bad. So he fled. He ran away. He fled to Midian. If you imagine Egypt, if you picture that in your mind, the other side of the Red Sea is where he would have fled to. And he found himself being kind to some shepherds and their family. And he ended up kind of being adopted again into a new family here. He finds himself adopted into this family, marries someone called Zipporah, and they have a son. And then we read there was a long period, actually about 40 years, and the king of Egypt eventually died. And then the Israelites were groaning, and there we are, we pick up today's story. Must have been quite a shock to his system. 40 years living in the wilderness of the mountainsides, caring for someone else's sheep after growing up in a royal palace. I wonder what he thought he was going to experience this day. You know, as he was just climbing the mountain, watching these sheep, looking out for wild animals, looking after his brother-in-law's flock. This day was anything but a normal day for Moses. And scholars think that he was probably around 80 at this time. So he wasn't a young man climbing this mountain. It was the day he received his call, his commission, and he began to discover God for who he really was. I wonder, have there ever been moments in your life when you've encountered God and thought, I know a little bit more of who God is from this encounter. I know a little bit more of this God. Have you ever been in a really thin place? Here we find Moses up Mount Horeb. It's actually the same mountain range as Mount Sinai, which we'll hear about a little bit later on as we journey through Exodus. And now when you think about a mountain, I often just naturally go to a mountain that kind of looks like Snowdon or maybe the Wrekin. Anyone walked up the Wrekin? It feels like a mountain when you walk up it. But actually, Horeb comes from a Hebrew term meaning desert. It means a very dry land. And it was a very vast area of mountainsides. And we read that this was the mountain of God. Now, you would have kind of gone up mountains because mountains have their own weather systems. And if you're in the desert, you need to access water. And I kind of had always just accepted that Moses was in this mountain before. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was like, hang on, well, why did he go up the mountain when he was looking after sheep? That's a lot of extra walking uphill. But actually, it snows on the top of these mountains in the desert. So there would have been water. There would have been greenery for I don't know what kind of greenery, I'm not a gardener, but there would have been greenery for the sheep to be able to forage on. They would have been there for life. So Moses was there looking out for his brother-in-law's flock. And what happens? Well, in this Exodus narrative, we read today that Moses experiences a very holy moment, and he's about to see something extraordinary. Now, a fire on a mountainside in itself wouldn't have been an unusual thing particularly, especially for a shepherd, because you'd make a fire to keep yourself warm. But Moses notices this fire. Not only does he notice it, he turns aside to see it. He chooses to look and investigate, and he chooses to be curious. How often do we notice something and just carry on walking by? How often do we actually stop and choose a side to look and to go curious and to walk towards it? And as he starts to move towards this fire, you can picture the scene, can't you? He begins to notice that this bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. Like, how? I mean, you see this bush on fire, and Moses approaches and hears God, and he hears God in this bush saying, Moses, Moses. I always imagine it as this kind of like booming, Moses, Moses, are you listening to me? I don't know. That's what films do to it, isn't it? Maybe it was a really gentle Moses. Moses, I'm here. And Moses replies to this bush, this angel by the bush, here I am. Here I am. How often is God trying to catch our attention and we don't reply with the here I am? And as Moses comes closer, he's told to take off his sandals because this ground was so holy. He needed to come to God and remove the things that were going to prevent him stepping into God with his kind of like dirtiness and bring it all to God. Anyone got one of those friends with like a really super clean house? Anyone? And you kind of go in there and you're like, oh, I don't want to like touch anything because this is so clean. I know a few people in this room who that is the case. And you go in and you're like, oh, I'm definitely taking my shoes off here, and I'll put my coat over here, and I'm going to sit down on this sofa. And if I've got any children, don't touch anything, don't touch anything. We've all got those friends, haven't we? And we respect that. It's beautiful. It's lovely to have a beautiful, clean home. Well, Moses' sandals would have been pretty dirty. Like, he walked through probably lots of animal dung and who knows what else. And his feet were probably pretty mucky. Oh, gone past it. They probably looked pretty mucky. Sorry if you've got any foot people a bit weird with feet are in the room. They were probably like quite hairy, mucky, gross feet. But in this moment, he says, take off your sandals. This is holy ground you're approaching. I wonder today if there are things that God wants us to take off as we approach him, to take off our sandals, to metaphorically remove our shoes and say, God, I'm ready to come close to you. I recognize your holiness. I recognize the ground that I'm standing on. God calls Moses by name, tells him to remove his sandals, but he's standing on this holy ground. The Hebrew word for holy, Kodesh, means like set apart. When God's presence manifests, ordinary places become extraordinary. Set apart for divine moments. Set apart, sacred, holy ground. It was like Moses was surrendering himself in that moment. What are the things that we walk in that are holding us back from stepping into the holy places God is calling us to? I wonder, have you ever been in a moment where it felt like heaven and earth were so close? A place where God's presence felt so close to you that it changed you. Well, Celtic Christians have a term for moments like this. They call it fin places. These are places where the veil between the divine and the ordinary almost feels transparent. Like the weight of God's presence transforms ordinary places into holy places. Where the gap between heaven and earth is so thin, you can almost touch it. Maybe you've experienced a time like this if you've had the privilege of being with someone as they've slipped away from this world to the next. Maybe you've witnessed a birth and held a newborn baby in your arms as you hear them cry for the first time. Maybe you've had experiences where you've known God's presence as close as him breathing on your face, where you felt that thinness of between heaven and earth, and there's divine presence with you. Maybe you've sensed it in times of worship, on a walk, or up a mountain. These are thin spaces, holy spaces, kadosh spaces, where the veil is so thin that we can almost see God. Now, this represents a kind of veil, the divine from the human. Thin places occur when this veil feels almost non-existent, when we catch a glimpse of God's glory and presence in a way that stays with us, and we cannot deny it. Has anyone ever experienced a moment like that, where you've sensed God so strong that you know his presence is with you? The thing is, though, in the Old Testament, where we are in this story, before Jesus came, these places were very rare. You know, later on, as we journey through the Bible, we see a temple built to house the presence of God because it's so holy that people can't go near it. And the veil there in this temple to house God's holiness was about 4 inches thick. That's about 10 centimeters. Imagine the weight of that curtain. It was so thick because it had to be kept away, had to be kept holy, set apart. And yet when Jesus came, When he died on the cross, that thick veil was torn in two from top to bottom. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus made a way for us to enter into God's presence freely. Those thin places are no longer rare. They're available to us because of Christ. Now, Moses experienced a thin place at the burning bush. And in the grand narrative of the whole Bible, we see again and again and again God's desire to dwell with us. In the Garden of Eden, in the tabernacle, and finally in Revelation, where God will dwell among us forever. In here, in Exodus, as Moses stands on holy ground, he's encountering God's presence so powerfully that he hides his face. It's like it's so powerful. He needs that veil. He needs that thinness to hide himself because it's so holy. I don't know if you've ever been in a time of worship where you've just found yourself fall to the ground. There was a time a couple of years ago when I was worshiping God and I was kneeling and I was just laying myself before him, and I genuinely just felt the weight of God's presence, and I couldn't get up. And it wasn't because my body had stopped working, and if I wanted to snap myself out of it and be free, I could have been, but it was like the weight of God's presence as I rested there. It was like I was approaching God in a thin place where I knew he was with me. And because of Jesus, we can have thin places in the most mundane of places. When we walk, when we see creation, when I drive my car and choose to focus my mind on God, when I seek him in prayer, when I worship, we can have rich encounters with God and his presence so overwhelming. When I first started driving, I was already going out with my husband, and he was a driver. He's a couple of years older than me. And when he would drive, there would often be times where I'd kind of just switch off from his conversation. We've worked through this in our marriage. And he thought I was daydreaming, but I was actually just talking to God. And it was like I was in such a place that I was like, no, I can't hear you. I'm just in this little zone with God. And he was so worried when I started learning to drive that I would just switch off on the road. And he was like, if you're doing this when I'm driving, what are you going to be like when you drive yourself? God made a way. It was fine. But we can find those thin spaces in the most mundane, ordinary moments, when we're cutting up the vegetables and preparing the food, when we're talking to someone on our street, when we're with our friends or family, when we're lying in bed at night. Those thin places are available to us. So when we experience that, it changes us, doesn't it? God speaks to Moses in this moment about his plan. He says he's heard the misery of the people in Egypt. He's heard them crying out. He's concerned about their suffering, and he wants to rescue them. And then God promises this abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey. And this echoes his kind of promise that he'd laid down with Abraham, a promise to bless, to redeem, to restore this land with milk and honey, where there's milk, there's cows or goats or something, where there's honey, there's flowers, there's bees, there's vegetation. It's going to be a beautiful, beautiful land. And then he says to Moses, okay, well, there's that promise. Now go. Now go. I'm sending you. And Moses is like to God, he kind of protests, who am I to go and rescue the Israelites? Who am I to go? Are there times in your life when God has said to you, Sue, go? Are there times when he said, Sani, go? Are there times when he said, go? Go. And then you've been like, well, who am I to do that? Who am I? I'm just little Laura that messes up and makes mistakes. Who am I to do this? But God says, I will be with you. I will be with you. Those thin spaces of experiencing my presence, you're going to carry with me. I'm not going to leave you. You're going to experience me. The veil between heaven and earth is small because I am with you. I'm living in you. Moses continues to protest, though. He was like, well, what shall I say to the Israelites? Like, okay, I'll go if you say you're going to be with me, but what shall I say to them? And God tells him his name. Wait for it. His name. I am who I am. Like, huh? Moses is probably like, what are you on about? Weird burning bush moment. I am who I am. But remember, this is a thin place, a holy kadosh moment, an encounter with God. He's left with something, the name of God. And for Moses, this would have revealed something about who God is. Aya, Asher, Aya. I am who I am. And it reveals deep truths about God's nature. Aya, the verb, means I am. It also means I will be, pointing to God's eternal, unchanging existence. It's a promise that God is not only present now, but he will be with us in the future. Asher can also mean who, what, or that. It emphasizes this kind of mystery and sovereignty over everything. Aya, Asher, Aya. God's name speaks of his sufficiency, his faithfulness, his closeness. The God of the burning bush is the same God who promises, I will never leave you or forsake you. I will be with you. Fin, kadosh, places change us. They're places of revelation. So in a moment, we're going to take a moment to just pause and to respond to God. I wonder what God is saying to you. Is he saying to you, look around. I'm trying to meet with you. Meet me in that thin place. Is God calling you to recognize his presence that's already there in your life? Maybe you felt like you're walking up a mountain and you've wondered where he is in the midst of it all. How might God be meeting you where you are?